Welcome to the ONS Energy Talks. I'm Anne Ekan from ONS, and with me today I have Kenneth Medlock from the Baker Institute in Houston. We're here to talk about the US presidential election, which no doubt will have significant consequences on many fronts. The focus of today's talk is the global energy markets. So Ken, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for asking me.
So we're now right on the countdown to the US presidential election. What will likely happen with energy policies if Biden wins?
Well, if Biden wins, undoubtedly energy policy will take a turn. I think first and foremost, you'll see a re-emphasis, much as you had under the previous administration with Obama, on environmental issues. This gets into things that have really been rolled back under the Trump administration relating to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and various other regulations that will, I think, almost immediately be reinstituted, thinking about methane regulations and other things. But more generally, I think you will see an emphasis on trying to push forward with a clean energy standard. And to the extent that can be nationwide, I think the administration will certainly push in that direction.
Thank you. And how about the consequences if Trump continues as president?
Well, ironically, I don't think the end result is terribly different, but it will be motivated by a different set of factors. In general, across the energy industry, there has been increasing pressure to reduce carbon intensity of operations, address not only scope 1, 2, but also 3 emissions. Which means really figuring out ways to engage in operating more deeply in offset markets, thinking about ways to reduce carbon footprints within their own operations. Firms, particularly in the hydrocarbon intensive space, are already moving in that direction. On the power front, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of what we've been seeing, which has largely been motivated by state policies and local preference. So, at the end of the day, what it means is the energy sector is going to get cleaner. It's really that simple. But I think the main driving factor is going to be ESG sentiment among investors and consumer preference.
Very interesting. And in your opinion, what are the biggest uncertainties tied to the election with regards to energy policies?
On the uncertainty front, it's probably how stiff the regulatory burden might become. Without a doubt, if the Trump administration remains in office, then those regulatory burdens are probably we're going to see more of the same, a continuation of rollback. If the Biden administration were to come into office, I think you get a very different sort of view. And I think what remains uncertain is how burdensome sort of new regulatory oversight might become, and to what extent things like carbon pricing or portfolio standards ultimately drive industries, firms across the energy industry, electricity, oil, gas, et cetera, into doing things that are a little bit more costly, but ultimately achieve the goal of reducing emissions.
So one of the things, looking at the US from the outside, we're wondering if Biden were to win, do you think he would take the US back into the Paris Agreement?
Absolutely. In fact, I think of all of the things that can be said with regard to a Biden administration and what it will bring for the U.S. presence in the global energy scene and global energy discussions is that bringing the U.S. back into the Paris Accords, because I and many others have been critical actually of the Trump administration removing the U.S. from the Paris Accords, but you really don't have a voice in the discussion if you don't have a seat at the table. And when you talk about climate negotiations, this is something dealing with energy transitions and climate change that is multilateral by definition. It is a problem of the global commons. So having a seat at the table is critical. And so absolutely, I think the Biden administration will see that happens.
So you alluded to it earlier, but regardless of who wins, do you think there's any chance that we will see CO2 taxes in the US in the next 4 years? And why not?
Just to reframe the question, if we'll see a CO2 tax?
CO2 tax in the US for the next 4 years.
Okay. Yeah, I think regardless of who wins, the momentum for that is growing, and it's growing with bipartisan support, which I think is very important. Layering into all of this, of course, is the significant growth in the budget deficit that is not unique to the United States, but is a knock-on of COVID, and we're not out of it yet. So the need for government revenues is growing. And certainly that's one mechanism through which you can generate revenue in the short term to address the budget shortfalls that have been matriculating because of COVID. So, that said, there are other policies that are in play, like that are based on nature-based solutions that would affect the ag sector positively, the Growing Climate Solutions Act. But there's certainly a lot of interest in seeing a carbon tax or a carbon fee and dividend where there's a rebate provided to lower income households, things of that nature. All of this is on the table. And I think regardless of who wins, it will be a centerpiece of legislation and debate.
Interesting, and partially fiscally, definitely fiscally driven. So I wanted to move on to US and international relations. How do you think this will be affected by the outcome of the US election? And let's start with the scenario that Trump continues as president.
Well, that's a complicated one, and it obviously has ramifications for the energy sector, but it's broader than that. Some of the moves that the Trump administration has taken with regard to trade policy and international negotiations on a bilateral basis. A lot of these things had been building for years, so it didn't really just sort of materialize when Trump stepped into office. So it's hard to imagine a renegotiation of existing trade pacts and a sort of completely different path in terms of international relations on the trade front, regardless of who wins. That said, I think a Biden administration, just to sort of flip the script, will probably be welcomed a little bit more to the table with regard to certain conversations on the international policy front, simply because it would be a breath of fresh air, so to speak. And there's going to be a lot of interest internationally in how the new administration, if it does actually come into office, would approach a lot of the same issues that Trump has been approaching with a very hardline stance. And so this steps beyond trade. It gets into the Iran nuclear deal and a host of other things that will ultimately be on the table should there be a shift in administration.
And also to include a very US-specific questions, we've heard a lot of people being worried about what will happen to fracking if Biden gets elected. What's your take on that?
Well, it's a great question, and it always comes up in these types of discussions. There's not a lot a president can do to affect hydraulic fracturing activity around the United States, largely because that activity has been occurring mostly on private lands. So this, for a president or any administration to do something to directly affect the ability to hydraulically fracture resources on private lands, requires constitutional amendment. So it's going to require legislation. I don't see that happening even if the Senate flips to Democrat. There are too many special interests aligned to sort of see a significant movement on that front constitutionally. With regard to federal lands, yes, the president can, by executive order, affect the ability to hydraulically fracture federal lands. We're already seeing some expectation of a shift in administration because there has evidently been an uptick in firms trying to get permits and move forward with drilling on federal lands in certain places like North Dakota and New Mexico. So certainly there'll be an impact, but it's not going to be that significant because, again, the majority of production from shale and the majority of hydraulic fracturing has been occurring on private lands, not federal.
Thanks. So I wanted to round off with the $1,000 question. It looks like the gap between the two candidates it looks to be very narrow. What is your best bet on the likely outcome?
Well, I would say that's the $1 million question, but I'll take 1,000 for it. But it's a tough call. Right now, I tend to think the polls are fairly indicative of the way things will play out. I think we'll probably end up seeing a Biden administration as we roll into 2021, ultimately taking office. Hopefully there'll be quick resolution. There won't be a sort of long, protracted discussion or significant challenges, but that remains to be seen. Having said all that, I can honestly tell you that in 2016, I anticipated a Clinton administration. So that should tell you something about my ability to forecast elections.
We'll all follow the elections very, very closely. Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your very interesting perspectives, and to everyone tuning into the ONS Energy Talks.
Thank you, Anne. It's great to see you again.